What is my property?
What's mine is mine, oh there's the line. Stop following me from the back all the time. There's one of me, one of a kind. Sorry I'm first, excuse me, do you mind? You wanna be this, I mean you prove me out the frame. I got my own style, so you must be insane. Yes, there's something else you can find, so don't touch mine, what's mine is mine.
Why do you want to be like me? Why do you want what's mine?
All right, folks, welcome back. In our last video, we finished by looking at the sources of ambiguity in Locke's theory. He bases his theory of property on obligations that we have to God and to our fellow humans. Now, there is a tradition of interpreting Locke that says that he puts these limitations on property only to lift them in the famous chapter 5, which you read. In this tradition, Locke's early statements about obligations are only the surface meaning of his text. The real meaning of it is covert. It relies on unspoken assumptions, and it's even a little bit shifty, and like I said to you before, atheistic. He doesn't intend these early arguments at all, these interpreters say. So these folks, who we're going to call the strong individualist interpreters, they say that in chapter 5, Locke offers three sort of sly alterations to those three arguments that we finished video with the last time. Those were the labor argument, the enough and as good obligation, and the no spoilage or no wastage requirement. All right, now the first covert alteration that they see in chapter 5 is that Locke seems to them to say that, well, perhaps we don't need to mix our own labor with something in order to make it our own. They say that he assumes the existence of wage labor in section 28 when he says that the turfs my servant has cut also become my property. And this seems to suggest that we can use wage labor to make something our own property, or in other words, we can buy the labor of others and that becomes our property as if it had been our own labor. And these interpreters say, second, that Locke sort of surreptitiously alters the requirement to leave enough and as good for others to say, well, we don't need to leave enough land or other capital assets for others as long as they're able to feed and clothe themselves with their wages. Locke says, for instance, in section 41, that a day laborer in England feeds, lodges, and is clad better than a king among the Native Americans. And these interpreters think that Locke is saying here that the laborer therefore can't complain, even if he doesn't really have any property of his own, any land or any capital. At least he's fed and clothed better than he would be in the state of nature. And they say, third, that Locke also sort of slips in that the invention of money created something which does not spoil, does not waste, and which can be stored up in vast sums. So Locke says about money in section 46 that man might heap up as much of these durable things, gold and silver, as he pleased, the exceeding of the bounds of his just property, not lying in the largeness of his possessions, but the perishing of anything uselessly in it. So they say, look at that. Money never wastes, it never spoils, and so it has no limits. So like I said, these interpreters are out there, ones who think that Locke really did intend to make a strong individualist argument for property rights. And they range from conservative critics of modern capitalist acquisitiveness, like Leo Strauss, to socialist critics of the same thing in capitalism, like C.B. Macpherson. But really, it's been a long time since most scholars of Locke moved on from this older tradition of interpretation, in part because in the effort to show that Locke harbored some of these assumptions of modern capitalism, these old interpreters had to twist the surface meaning of the text so far, and they had to attribute to Locke these sort of hidden nefarious meanings. More recently, interpreters have started to think that the story that Locke tells in chapter 5 isn't the story of the triumph of an emergent capitalist class, but instead it's a story of decline in which the property that people make for themselves leads to vicious disputes among them. Take, for instance, section 36, part of which I'm going to put up in front of you. Locke says, "This I dare boldly affirm, that the same rule of propriety, that every man should have as much as he could make use of, would still hold in the world without straitening anybody, since there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants. had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put a value on it introduced by consent larger possessions and a right to them. So he's not saying here that there is no right to larger possessions, but perhaps we've reached a state of the world where some people are straitened or constricted by those who claim more and more for themselves. People can no longer have as much as they could make use of, or in other words, enough and as good as in our other quote. That, these people suggest, creates a problem. Now, these newer interpreters say that money is to blame. In fact, they point to section 48, where Locke talks about people who use money hoarding that money up and hoarding land. So this would imply that they have a right to those things, but it's still some sort of moral offense. It's excessive. It's a disordered desire. It is hoarding. Indeed, Locke gives this example in section 36 in front of you, which starts to indicate that he might use eminent domain to correct this maldistribution of land. He says, "The extent of ground is of so little value without labor that I have heard it affirmed that in Spain itself, a man may be permitted to plow, sow, and reap without being disturbed upon land he has no other title to but only his making use of it. But on the contrary, or in other words, although he has no other title, you would think that folks around him would blame him for that. He says, but on the contrary, the inhabitants think themselves beholden to him who, by his industry on neglected and consequently waste land, has increased the stock of corn, which they wanted, or in other words, lacked." Okay, so let me leave this quote in front of you so we can pick it apart a little bit. Remember, those older interpreters had said that you no longer need to labor on your land and you can keep vast tracts of land so long as you hire others to labor and so long as your profits from it come in the form of money, which doesn't spoil. But here in this quote, Locke seems to be considering the possibility of a wealthy landowner who's not using all of his property. Some of it is vacant, and the townspeople don't have enough to eat, i.e. that corn which they wanted or lacked. The wealthy man might indeed be hiring people to work other parts of his land, and he might be making profits in money, but the townspeople don't have enough and as good, as it were. They don't have land or food and clothing for themselves. So Locke's answer to this situation in this quote could be that even though this property is justly owned by that wealthy owner, it must still actually fulfill all three of the rules that I showed Locke laying out earlier. It must have labor expended on it. He says it's worth nothing without that. So now labor is an obligation. It's a requirement. It's not just the source of a right. Second, it must produce food and clothing that the people need, enough and as good of that stuff. And you can see here a new definition of waste being applied as well. This land isn't spoiled, but it's simply vacant, neglected, unused, and this he explicitly calls waste. Another way to think about this, Locke is saying that people can own property and use it how they wish, but it must be used. It must be labored upon. It must be productive, or else someone else can claim the use of it, not the title to it, but the use of it. In fact, these new interpreters say that, well, it seems like he actually makes this point repeatedly in chapter 5. Section 38 says that you can't allow property to spoil or that the wasted part of it belongs to others. He talks about a property owner who's grown food or even grass on his land to feed his cattle, but he didn't use the food or the grass. So Locke says this about it: notwithstanding his enclosure, his excess land was still to be looked on as waste and might be the possession of any other. Because this owner spoiled the product of his land, the land itself, the part that was used to grow that excess, which he apparently didn't need, the land itself could be claimed by someone else. Or consider section 37. It says that a man may own property because in doing so he will increase the common stock of mankind, and it implies that you do this by lessening the amount of land that you use. Locke seems to praise productivity here because it leads to more land being left in common for others. He says this: he that encloses land and has a greater plenty of the conveniencies of life from 10 acres than he could have from 100 left to nature may truly be said to give 90 acres to mankind. Or in other words, By reducing his usage to just 10 acres, he leaves those other 90 that he would have needed to mankind to claim. So Locke seems to be saying that our usage of land is limited in some way. It must be put to productive use. In his language, we must improve that land, increase its output. We saw that language in section 42. And we're still obligated to the members of our community, as he had said in section 6. Our productivity can benefit us in unspoiled gold, but if it doesn't benefit others as well, then our wasted resources can be commandeered and repurposed. So at this point, we really do know a bit more about what he meant in section 42 when he said that the great art of government is the increase of lands and the right employing of them. And maybe this is what he was allowing government to do in that famous eminent domain clause in the Constitution of the Carolinas. You'll remember that that clause in front of you now said that governments could do things like building highways and canals and could take lands for draining fens, i.e. marshes, so that it could be used as fertile farmland. And really, all of these things imply that government should be engaged in facilitating the growth of trade, even if it has to take private land to do that. And that example of fens implies that this is true even if that land is taken to be assigned to another private individual to be used and to be worked more productively. Okay, there's no doubt that Locke says in section 139 that kings and lords shouldn't take land to themselves, as he says at that point. But as long as they benefit the public, not themselves, a government, he thinks, can exercise this power of eminent domain. Now, we're going to see in our next set of videos that that is what the US Supreme Court was saying in Kelo versus New London. We may not like each instance of a taking, they say, but there's nothing in the theory of the Constitution, which may be John Locke's theory. There's nothing in the theory of the Constitution, they say, which would forbid those takings if the property is not being used productively, perhaps even if it's not being used as productively as it could be. The words that Locke uses are things like waste, something that's either lying unused when others have no need of the product of it, or something that's positively rotting in the hands of those who currently control and claim it. The word that the Supreme Court uses instead is blighted, but the idea is the same. Perhaps Locke was the first to say that the role of government is to ensure that the right employing of property is to increase material output enjoyed not just by the individuals who claim property, but by the public at large. Maybe he was the first to say that this is what justifies government actions. And that would be, we'll see, not unlike the Supreme Court's approval of public benefits. Perhaps this is why Locke seems to approve of eminent domain. So keep Locke's theory in mind as you turn to our next set of 3 videos about Supreme Court law on eminent domain takings. I really look forward to discussing with you in class our eminent domain test case, which is actually about regulatory takings. So please be aware you're actually going to have to watch all 3 of those videos about takings to get to that issue about regulatory takings in the 3rd, and in order to understand it, to apply it to our test case in class. All right, I'll see you then.